If you're a fair dinkum full-blown Aussie, then chances are you know exactly what this engine is. If you're not a fair dinkum full-blown Aussie, well, this is a Chrysler Hemi inline 6-cylinder engine. That's right, the Australian Hemi motor. And I've been really excited to do the disassembly on this bad boy for a few reasons. First of which is that it is one of my favourite engines of all time. I just love the look of them. They've got massive cultural significance here in Australia. And also, this is an engine that came out of one of my vehicles. So I've got a VJ Valiant wagon. This was the original engine. When I bought it, this thing seemed super clapped out, and I'm actually interested to see what's going on inside of this thing. Now, what we're going to do today in this episode is tell you guys about the history of this engine, why it came to be, the cultural significance of this engine in Australia, and we're going to strip it apart to show you the architecture of this motor and explain what makes it such a classic Aussie engine. This 215 Hemi 6 is actually out of my 1973 Chrysler Valiant VJ wagon. Now, I've ripped this engine out because it seemed to be clapped out. It was really clattery and lifted ticky, and I replaced it with a nice fresh 245 Hemi, which was given to me with the car. So I've freshened this one up to put in the vehicle. So if you want to learn more about Australian Valiants and even more about Hemi engines, go back and check out that episode. Now, to understand the history behind this engine, we have to go right back to the 1950s when Chrysler released the Slant 6 in their A-body of vehicle. Their A-body being the compact level of vehicle, and that was the Dodge Dart and Plymouth Valiant. They were released with the Slant 6 in like 170 cubic inch variants and 225 cubic inches. So the Hemi 6 was released in 1970 in a car called the VG Valiant. Now, when it was released, compared to contemporary inline 6s produced by Holden and Ford, this was a game changer. This is my 1973 VJ Valiant wagon, and underneath the bonnet of this thing we have a Hemi 6 in its natural habitat, the engine bay of an Aussie Mopar. Now, we might think of these as being an Australian 6-cylinder, but they actually started their life in America. Back in 1966, Chrysler America started developing these as a larger 6-cylinder engine to replace the Slant 6 in heavy-duty applications such as pickup trucks. What Chrysler in America soon realised is that they were developing an engine that nobody really wanted. If somebody wanted a small economy 6-cylinder, they'd just buy a Slant 6. If they wanted more power, they'd just get a 318 LAV8. So what was the point of designing an entirely new engine for a slot in the market that wasn't there? So development for this engine, known as the D series of engine, was actually scrapped. Well, at least until somebody from the Chrysler brass realised that this would make an excellent replacement for the Slant 6 here in Australia, where, quite frankly, in the late 60s and early 70s, we absolutely frothed a good inline 6-cylinder, and this would be the one to trump them all. So that begs the question, is this really an Australian engine? Can I call it a classic Aussie engine? Well, yes, because what they actually did was they sent 3 of the pre-production prototype engines from America to Australia for Australian engineers to refine into what we finally got as a Hemi 6. This was alongside help of the Americans, so there was a big amount of Australian input into these engines, and we finessed them here in this country to be some of the fastest inline 6 engines at the time, and I reckon that's a pretty incredible story. Now, before we start, I just want to say this is a 215 cubic inch version of the Hemi, and the Hemi came in 3 different flavours. The 215, the 245, 265. The 215 being more for economy use, taxi drivers, people who wanted to be frugal with their fuel consumption. The 265 was the biggest and highest performing. It was the one that was in the E49 Charger, which is the ultimate in Hemi performance and one of the coolest Aussie cars ever made. That's a story in itself. But you can see straight off the bat, these things are a non-cross-flow design, very stereotypical of inline 6s of the time. But One thing it has going for it is this beautiful inlet manifold design. You can see now that it's off, you've got these nice flowing curves. That's all about preventing air restriction, and as we know, to get power and efficiency out of your engine, you want the air-fuel mixture to be able to enter the engine and the exhaust released out of the engine as cleanly and as smoothly as physically possible. Chrysler obviously put some thought into this, because if I show you a Holden inline 6 manifold, check out that bad boy. This is full of right angle bends. You can see the air is constantly ramming into essentially dead ends where it has to make a right angle to enter the engine. So that's a really inefficient design, not terrific for making power. And before you start complaining, I'm not dissing the Holden red motor, I'm just saying that the Hemi 6 definitely has its advantages. Unfortunately, this manifold on the base engines is made out of cast iron and is super heavy. The Holden 6 always had aluminium inlet runners on the red motors, and they are much, much lighter. Now, with the inlet manifold off, you can really get a gauge as to why these things have a much higher power potential than the Slant 6. So that's the manifold gasket, and of course, being a non-crossflow design, the gasket is one integral piece. So this has to accommodate for being an inlet manifold gasket and an exhaust manifold gasket in the one unit. And this one's actually like a laminated stainless steel gasket, which is actually the best kind. These don't really blow out like those sort of composite gaskets, which are generally terrible. But you can see the massive size of the ports on these bad boys compared to its contemporary equivalents. What we have here is a cylinder head off a 289 Windsor V8, so of course a Ford motor. As you can see, you've got your inlet ports here, and if you correspond them with the Chrysler ports, they're somewhat similar in size. But when I flip it over, check out those little bubby exhaust ports. Holy doolies. The exhaust ports on the Hemi just dwarf these bad boys. And once again, I'm not saying the Windsor's a bad engine, but these just have a really good power potential, and that is half of the secret. Just going to pull this rocker cover off. It's got 11 7/16 fasteners holding it down, and boom! You can see straight away that this does have a bit of sludge buildup, but really it's not too bad in the grand scheme of things. You can also start to see why these things were able to produce more power than other contemporary 6s, and the reason being is this valve canter. You can see I have one cylinder here, you've got two valves going in, and they are facing towards each other just very slightly. It might not seem like much, but because they are facing away from the cylinder wall, they were able to use a bigger valve size. We'll get to see that in just a moment. This is one of the rocker arms out of this Hemi. As you can see, very typical design for a 1970s engine. As you can see, it pivots on the ball of the fastener that holds it into the pedestal. That's an interesting little design, but also fairly typical of an engine of this time. Has a little oiling hole here because it is fed oil through the pushrod. The pushrod is actually hollow, and that's what lubricates this pivoting portion of the rocker arm. Another interesting thing with the Hemis versus the Slant 6 is that these come with a side plate built into the side of the engine block. This allows access to the lifters, which you can actually service and or replace without removing the cylinder head, which is a great design. Boom! Look at the schmutz on the inside of that bad boy. That's an indication of poor maintenance. Bam! Well, you can see obviously it hasn't had very good coolant in it, if it actually had coolant at all. At least in Australia we don't really have the issues where cylinder blocks will crack open if you don't have antifreeze in them. So a lot of people opt, at least back in the day, to run just straight water. So that's a fairly good sign that somebody did just that. Also, I was researching the origins of this engine. I came across some information saying that Chrysler at the time were really putting a lot of emphasis on making their engines lighter, and this was done through a range of different techniques, of course making portions of the engines thinner, using better metallurgy and just better casting designs. This is really observed in the LA series of V8 engines, so Chrysler's sort of muscle car era small blocks. They were called LA engines because they were lightened A series engines. The more you know. But I think it really becomes apparent in this block here. When you're looking up the water jacket in the side of the block, you can get a gauge as to the thickness of the wall of the side of the block, and it's actually pretty thin. And that is the case on both sides. Now, why make better power if you have to lug around more weight? It just makes the whole procedure null and void. If you can make your engine both lighter and more powerful, then you're getting benefits all over the place. And if you're interested, look into the history of the inline 6 Hemi motor, because there's a lot of fun stuff. Apparently when they were designing these things and they were taking them for laps around their track or whatever, they lightened the engine block so much that the sump pretty much had come off of the prototype engine due to block flex. That's incredible. So obviously they made them stronger than that. Just before I pull this harmonic balancer off, I want to point out two things. The first of which is that the balancer is starting to fail. You can see the rubber's starting to come out of it there. And the fact that it doesn't have a balancer retaining bolt on the front of the crank. Now that was really common practice back in the 1970s. The Holden Red motor was like this. Small block Chevys, the early ones, had that. And it was perfectly adequate just to use the interference fit between the balancer and the crank to hold it on. But under high performance applications, you'd probably want to put a retaining bolt there because the balancer can walk itself off over time. And also if you're running an adjustable crankshaft sprocket, so you can adjust the positioning of your cam in relation to the crank, you want to use that bolt as well because it puts pressure on the sprocket, and it means that it can't chatter against the keyway. Holy doolies. Look at the sludge in that bad boy. Flaming heck. That is probably the original timing chain that this engine came out with back in 1973, and I can tell you that because it's got the original crank sprocket. Quite often the aftermarket ones come with multiple different slots for the keyway, allowing you to adjust your cam timing in relation to the crank for performance applications, aftermarket cams, being able to dial in your cam for extra power. But eagle-eyed viewers will also note that there's no hydraulic tensioner tensioning this chain. Now they got away with that with the fact that the chain is so small it doesn't really need any tensioning device. And to show you how knackered it is, I'm just going to show you how much crank rotation I can get before it makes any difference to the cam. That is a massive amount in terms of engine timing, and what that means is that you're losing horsepowers. So if you've got a big Hemi engine driving the rear wheels in your Valiant, you're going to want to do a stinky burnout. And if you don't have any power, how are you going to do a burnout? These are things that you have to consider. That's the Hemi timing chain. That's the Ecotech chiming chain. You might notice that there's something missing in this vicinity here. And that is, of course, a cam retaining plate that pretty much every other motor has, especially of this type. And you might be wondering, well, how did they stop the cam from moving forward? The main reason the cam doesn't move forward is due to the distributor drive gear, which is, of course, a beveled gear. As that rotates, it generally pushes the cam backwards in the block towards the plug in the back of the block, keeping it in place. It is kind of a design flaw of the Hemi, and I'll explain why. In that, if you have excessive wear in the distributor gear, or also you've just got an engine built on a Friday or something, that cam will sometimes move so far forward, it will actually rub on the inside of the timing cover. And you can actually see that here. Check that out. You've got a little witness mark in the oil where the cam sprocket has contacted. Chrysler was aware of this issue, and one of the dealer fixes that they had was to drill a hole in here, put a captive nut on the outside, so weld a captive nut there, and put a bolt through that nut to press on the front of the cam gear there, keeping it back in the block. Now, that's a pretty horrific dealership fix, but mind you, this is the 1970s and you could get away with a fair bit more back then. Now that we've got the sump off, we can see another aspect that differs it from the slant six, and that is these bad boys. Those are your main bearing caps, and you can see there are 7 of them. That's interesting in that the slant six only has 4 main bearings. So does that make the Hemi stronger? Well, yeah, probably. But it also means that it is less compact. So the reason the slant six only has 4 main bearings is that every single main bearing that you put in adds to the total length of the engine. Chrysler really wanted a short engine, a real compact engine, hence the slant. But with 7 main bearings, this is in fact stronger. It also helps with engine harmonics as well. These things actually resemble a Jeep 4-litre inline 6 more than they resemble the slant 6. What we're going to do is remove the oil pump next. Like, the amount of wear on those cam lobes is insane. This motor was definitely on its way out. And the reason I pulled this engine out of the car and made the decision to go to the 245, which I knew was in good condition, was this thing had really bad lifter clatter after the vehicle had warmed up. And that just led to me to believe that the engine was pretty much just worn diddly. And my suspicions were correct. This cam is on its way out. Judging by the shape of the lifters, they wouldn't have had much time left either before they would have just wiped themselves to smithereens. I've just pulled one of the lifters out of this rig. You can see it might be a bit difficult. There is a concave in the face of the lifter. These are flat, what they call flat tappet hydraulic lifters, meaning that they just have a flat surface that rides on the cam, so metal on metal contact. Unlike the Commodore that we pulled apart the other week, where it had a roller lifter. That is a far superior design, the roller lifter, but back in the 1970s, this was very normal. That would either have to be refaced, or you'd just buy a whole new set of lifters, and luckily you can still buy them for this motor and it's not terrifically expensive. One thing that people aren't necessarily aware of with flat tappet cams is that it is incredibly important that the lifter rotates when it's coming in contact with the cam lobe.
The way it does that is that when the cam is machined, the lobe is machined at a very, very slight angle. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. It's very difficult to see, but this surface here will actually have a slight taper. What that means is that the highest point on the cam lobe will come in contact with the lifter, and it grabs more, causing the lifter to rotate like that. Now, the biggest killer for flat tappet cams is when the lifter stops rotating on top of the cam, and what that means is that it's impacting the same spot on the lifter over and over and over. It doesn't spread the load of the wear, it just wears in the one spot. So with these sort of old engines, it is really important to make sure that the lifter is turning, and the best way to do that is actually to draw little lines on the push rods, and when the motor is running, you got to make sure the push rods are spinning around as they are actuated by the lifter.
Now we're getting to what I reckon is going to be the most interesting portion of this video, where I zippity zap this big stonking cylinder head off this bad boy to show you guys exactly why this thing is called a Hemi. Oh. Oh. Holy heck. Straight off the bat, there's a slight ring ridge right at the top of the cylinder. This is caused by the fact that the piston rings don't ride on this very topmost portion of the bore, and therefore that doesn't wear anywhere near as quickly as the lower section. That gives you a good indication as to how worn the rest of the bores truly are by the depth of that ridge. Also, another thing is that it has very little cross-hatching on the bores whatsoever. They're actually really shiny. So this engine, let's just say, is definitely a well-worn unit. I'd love to know exactly how many Ks the car has on it. The odometer says 68,000 kilometers, but I'm guessing that's either 168 or 268,000. And mind you, this engine was built back in the days where you pretty much had to put a set of rings and stuff in an engine every 150,000 Ks. That was really, really common. There's a bit of carbon buildup, but that's also fairly normal as well, because you just don't have the fuel metering accuracy with a carburetor as what you do with electronic fuel injection, and that also adds to the increased wear of older engines, because essentially carburetors are really bad for adding too much fuel. That will actually wash the oil off of the rings, causing a poor lubrication against the side of the bore. Just another reason why EFI is awesome. Now this is the portion of the video that you guys have probably been waiting out for. This is what makes the Hemi a Hemi. Now, if you know your sort of typical engine constructions, you're interested in the old Chrysler V8s and what have you, you will know that the term Hemi in regards to an engine means that they have used a portion of a hemisphere to construct the combustion chamber. There's a lot of benefits to that, particularly airflow. But this doesn't really look like a portion of a hemisphere. It, if anything, looks somewhat hemispherical. And really what that comes down to is that Chrysler in Australia took the liberty of using the Hemi moniker that they were using, of course, in America on their V8s to describe this engine. Now, a lot of people get their knickers in a knot about that. It's not a true Hemi. Well, look, you're dead right. It's somewhat hemispherical. However, it does resemble a Hemi-like construction. And admittedly, it was still a far better combustion chamber than any other of the contemporary inline sixes made by the big three. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. Even though it's not a true hemispherical design, I'm going to forgive Chrysler in Australia for calling it that because it's still a fairly good combustion chamber design. Compared to other motors such as the Red motor and the Falcon 200 non-crossflow, you don't have a huge amount of valve shrouding on the side of the valves. Now, this is due to their canted design. They actually move away from the casting in the side of the combustion chamber, and there's still a fair amount of space there for fuel-air mixture to be released into the cylinder. Engines that are really bad for valve shrouding are motors such as, say, like the Holden grey motor, even the Red motor, where the combustion chamber is more of a recession in the head that kind of almost follows the shape of the valves. But this thing also has fairly big valves compared to other engines of the time as well. Very similar in size to the Ecotec that I pulled apart in a previous episode. And this isn't even their highest performance cylinder head. It's anything but. This is the smallest engine, the lowest compression, and the smallest valves. But one thing I will note is that it is still a non-crossflow design, which doesn't work in its favor because air has to come in from the port up here. It has to come down out of the valve, make a right angle bend, exit through the exhaust valve, and then go back out. So it's a fairly poor flowing design in that regard, but in all other aspects it's actually quite good. One thing that I'd like to point out that Chrysler did was their valve arrangement in regards to its order. So they've gone exhaust, intake, exhaust, intake, exhaust, intake, whereas a lot of other engines of this time went, say, exhaust, intake, intake, exhaust, exhaust, intake, intake, exhaust. Now this, in my mind, is a better construction. Now, I'm no engineer, I'm just a mechanic standing in a shed pulling apart an engine and making observations, so don't get all antsy on me for this. I reckon if you put two exhaust valves together, you're more likely to create a hotter portion in the cylinder head, especially in this bit between the two combustion chambers. I'm going to call that the cylinder head gooch. So that gooch section would get a bit hotter in my mind and would be more likely to crack across there or cause increased heat build up in the valve seats and cause them to crack. And it may also be more likely to blow head gaskets, of course, due to that increased heat in that section. Because these are spaced apart, you've got, say, the hot section here, the hot section here, the hot section here. They're not right next to each other, say, on other cylinder head arrangements. Now, I think other manufacturers group them together just to make it easier for them to build inlet and exhaust manifolds. Say with the Holden Red motor, it is of course easier for them to have grouped those two intake ports in the center and then two further out on each side, so they could just make a really nice, clean, compact inlet manifold. And say it's horses for courses. GM obviously wanted to make a nice, compact, light engine in that case, whereas Chrysler took more of a performance and efficiency orientation with this engine. This is a very interesting comparison because you've got two fairly contemporary cylinder heads. Look, admittedly, the Windsor was designed probably a bit earlier than the Hemi from what I can gather. But as you can see, the valve shrouding on the Windsor is absolutely terrible. The side of the combustion chamber really encroaches on the valve, and you could imagine as this valve opens, the space in which the exhaust, in this case, has to escape through, has to make it through this little gap around this area here. And what that also means is that when people opt for putting larger valves in their engines, in some cases they're making this problem worse because essentially all you're doing is moving the opening area closer to the wall of the combustion chamber. So putting performance parts in your engine doesn't necessarily mean you're getting more performance. You can see with the Hemi here, you've got heaps of room here to go a little bit bigger with your valves, but there is nowhere near the same extent of valve shrouding just due to, of course, its inherent design. This is a really interesting comparison. I like this one a lot because we've got two classic Aussie 6-cylinder engines. Of course, this one here is a Ford Falcon 4-litre single overhead cam engine. It's actually the one I pulled apart in the first episode, so if you haven't watched that one, go and check it out. Very interesting. But as you can see, this is a cross-flow design, so the air comes in through the intake port, is released into the cylinder via the intake valve. It really doesn't have to change much in direction to then be released through the exhaust valve and out the exhaust port once the air-fuel mixture is spent. Whereas in the Chrysler, it has to come in through this one and makes a complete U-turn to go out the exhaust port. Now, as we all know, if you can get gases in and out of the engine with as little restriction as possible, that's efficient and that makes power. So the Falcon cylinder head is far more advanced. You don't really have any shrouding areas around the valves, or very little. And once the valves open, because they've got such a severe canter on them, they actually de-shroud themselves the further they move into the combustion chamber. Now, they've kind of taken one out of Chrysler's books here because they have a really severe valve canter, which is, in my books, a good thing. The reason they've been able to have such a good design is mostly due to the single overhead cam construction and the fact that that actuates on rockers and therefore allows them to space the valves really far apart. Unfortunately, Chrysler didn't use any of that wizardry back in the 70s, but for what they had, they did a pretty good job. Now, that begs the question, if Chrysler survived into the 1980s or into the 90s in Australia, what could they have done if they'd continued to keep designing engines in Australia here? Would they have come up with something as truly brilliant as the single overhead cam Falcon and, of course, the Barra motor? These are questions that will never be answered because, of course, Chrysler Australia Limited folded in 1981. Well, they stopped making cars here in 81 and were taken over by Mitsubishi. Getting to the pointy end of the stick on this bad boy, you're going to pull a piston and rod out of it, main cap, just to give you guys an understanding as to what they look like and the condition of this engine. But I'm going to keep the rest of it together and put it in storage as a spare for my Valiant. I might hot it up or something like that. And that brings me to the question, if you were going to hot up one of these engines, get a few more berries out of it, how do you go about it? Well, the good thing about these is that even from factory, they had a myriad of different camshafts and different performance modifications that the factory did to these. If you're an American and you want to see a really cool muscle car era 6-cylinder vehicle, 2-door, look up a vehicle called the E49 Valiant Charger. They came with triple Weber carburetors from factory, a super lumpy cam, and they were built specifically for racing at Bathurst. So you know it's going to be good. They actually had the quickest quarter-mile time for any Australian car up until like the mid-1990s or something like that. Just incredible for a 6-cylinder vehicle. And all off the back of Aussie engineering. So with that said, you can get, say, E49 camshafts, all the supporting modifications to turn your Hemi into a E49 spec engine. Now, that's the biggest thing with these. If you want to hot one up, the camshaft is the way to go. You can get so many different cams for them, like stage 1, 2, 3, towing packs, E49, E38, all that sort of stuff. But if you're going to put a camshaft in it, make sure you've got the supporting modifications on the engine as well. So, good flowing inlet manifold and carburetor, good flowing exhaust manifold / extractors, good flowing exhaust. Make sure that your tuning is correct once you've done all this stuff, and make sure that the engine is in really good condition before you start throwing parts at it. If I was going to build one, which I probably might in the future for my Valiant, I would probably get a twin barrel inlet manifold, set of extractors, a mild cam with a little bit of chop, probably do a bit of port matching in the cylinder head to make sure the inlet exhaust ports match the gasket, or at least match the manifold that's going on it. Just simple, normal hot rodding stuff for engines of this era. One nice thing that Chrysler did was actually numbered the rod caps and the rods. So it means I don't have to center punch them, which is supposedly a no-no, but I've never listened to professionals in the past, and I'm not going to start now. Whee! Well, there you go, there's a piston out of it. As you can see, the actual thrust surfaces on the skirts are actually in really good condition. This did, however, grab the side of the bore really badly on the way out. The actual rings grabbed that ring ridge at the top, and I had a bit of trouble getting it out of the cylinder. But check out that. As you can see, it is exceedingly worn. The main bearing is definitely not as bad, but you can see there are signs that there have been impurities in the oil that have gone through the oil system, causing premature wear of these bearings. You can see these sort of little dots. They're a telltale sign that schmutz has gotten through this engine, which is a bit of a shame, but the crankshaft looks like it has at some stage sat with moisture on it. So I'm wondering whether or not this vehicle, or at least this engine, was sort of used in a stop-start scenario. Maybe an old lady owned it and they only drove down to the shops like once a week or something, allowed moisture to build up inside the engine as it never got hot enough to burn off, and was allowed to sit on these bearing surfaces, and it actually corroded the crank a little bit. Before I wrap this video up, I thought I'd get some contemporary accounts as to things that actually used to go wrong with these things back in the 1970s and 80s when they were sort of more in service. And from all the cranky old mechanics that I talked to, I think the main issue with them was tunability, their tuning issues. They used to run fairly rough at idle, and they were difficult to keep in tune, and the carburetor itself was a bit of a pain in the butt, because to adjust the float level, you had to pull the float bowl off the bottom of the carby, and you had to pull the carby off of the engine to access the float bowl screws. But that, in conjunction with the fact that it has a big long intake manifold, they like to run like a hairy goat at idle because they lose inlet runner velocity and the fuel comes out of distribution properly, etc., etc. Just typical inline six issues from back in the day. That, in conjunction with you know, the normal 1970s engines requiring new rings and big end and main bearings every 150 to 200,000 Ks due to old school metallurgy and old school oil technology. And also that cam thrust retainer plate thing I was telling you guys about earlier, that was a bit of a problem with it as well. Other than that, they don't really seem to have massive inherent faults, and some people, at least in Australia, like to say that these things are actually more reliable than the Slant 6, and that is saying a lot. That brings me to the portion of the episode where I ask the question, what makes this such a classic Aussie engine? Well, so many different answers to that question, but I think one of the main things is their race heritage. These things came in, of course, the Valiant Chargers raced around Bathurst. There's an awesome photo of one of these Hemis, triple carbies hanging off the side, and the exhaust extractors glowing red hot, like the thing's just being redlined on a dyno all day. Best photo of all time. That and the Holden Monaro photo where the Sheila's in the yellow suit hopping out of the car, that is a great photo. But race heritage, they're the underdog. They never won Bathurst, and I think people in Australia do like the underdog. Chrysler here was the underdog for so many years, and they just inevitably succumbed to the fact that they could just never make as much money as the other ones, as Ford and Holden. Also, these things look great under the bonnet of vehicles. They're just such a cool looking engine, and the fact that they were better than the comparable 6 cylinders of the other manufacturers. These things would even beat V8s off the line back in the day, from what I can gather. Now, there will inevitably be a Holden fanatic or a Ford fanatic out there, and they'll go, oh, but the 308 Holden V8 motor is the best engine ever made, or, oh, the Cleveland engine is just the best engine ever made. Look, they might be in your books, but quite frankly, I don't care. These videos are about exploring pieces of Australian history. I'm not saying this one's the best engine out there, or even better than your Clevo or 308 or whatever. I'm just saying that this is a cool piece of Australian history worth looking into and worth protecting for future generations. And on that note, we'll catch you next time when we pull apart another cool engine on Full Bore.